quite easy when your house looks like a witch's lair, or is a witch's lair, essentially. So I hope you enjoy it. In my mind, I want everything to look like the I Would Do Anything for Love music video by Meatloaf. That's kind of the sweet spot aesthetically for me. Of course, I don't quite have Meatloaf's budget, or Michael Bay's budget for that matter, so I'm starting small, working my way up. It's lovely that you can be at home enjoying this. Of course, that means you can put your feet up, you can relax, and quite literally pick your poison, enjoy a drink. So cheers, everybody, for being here with me this evening. I hope you enjoy. I'm due to be on for an hour. The event was billed for an hour. I will do my best to stick to that hour, but John didn't realise when he booked me for this talk that he'd booked the folkloric equivalent of Little Miss Chatterbox. So I will do my best. If there is anything I have to skip through because we are tight for time, then don't worry, I'll share it on my Instagram afterwards, so we shouldn't miss anything out. So welcome to the Folklore of Lowestoft and Beyond. When I wrote the title for this, I initially meant beyond by the locality of Lowestoft, the immediate area around Lowestoft. But really now I think it's in part more to do with the fact that we're quite a lot leaving the physical realm during today's talk. So I hope you enjoy the paranormal and the weird just as much as I do. To give you a little bit of a background on me, this is myself, East Anglian Kate. If you're already here, then I'm assuming you know who I am. It's quite easy to walk in on me doing one of my talks in a local pub. It's not quite so easy to walk in on me doing a talk when it's a ticketed online event. So I'm assuming you already know a little bit about me. If you don't, just a little bit of a background on who I am and what I do. So I go by the name of East Anglian Cage, but my name is Katie Hardy, Katie, Kate, Cage, KG, KG Shazay if you're my brother up in Edinburgh. I've had many different names over the years, many nicknames. Take your pick or add to it. I even had an era where I was known as Haggis. I don't know why. From about the age of 9 to 13, that was my Haggis era. No links to Scotland, so that name appeared and disappeared as mysteriously as it could. So yeah, take your pick. I'm an East Anglian girl, born and bred, and I'm very proud of that. Maybe not so much during my teen years. I think during my teen years, I found East Anglia quite boring, if I'm honest. But as I've gotten older, I've come to really love what East Anglia stands for in terms of its folkloric and historic roots. I was fortunate enough to study history at the University of East Anglia. The irony is not lost on me that as an East Anglian, I didn't go far to go to university. There's a lack of social mobility, let's say, in East Anglia. But it's got a fantastic school of history, and I was very, very fortunate to be able to study the history of the European witch trials of the early modern era under the mentorship of the incomparable Malcolm Gaskill. He is a professor who's widely known for his expertise when it comes to witchcraft, particularly in the field of Matthew Hopkins and his witch trials in East Anglia. So I was very, very fortunate to study under his mentorship. And that's really where my love of all things witchcraft really began. I've been a practicing witch now as well from about 2017, 2018. It's a big part of who I am. It's a big part of my lifestyle. I raised my daughter with that mindset. So I love all things witchcraft and witchcraft history, and folklore really fits in nicely alongside that. Folklore I haven't necessarily studied academically, but it's been something that's been a massive part of my life since about the age of 14. I would say it really sunk its claws into me, a story I'll be sharing with you a little bit later on. So yeah, I like to, in what I do, sort of create a perfect marriage between my two passions of history and folklore in a lovely term I like to use called folkstery. I didn't invent that word, but shall we just pretend tonight that I did? And folkstery is really, for me, it's the sweet spot in terms of celebrating the landscape of an area, but also celebrating its folkloric structures as well alongside that. So after I graduated from the UEA, I spent all years since teaching in local schools. I've been a high school teacher and a primary teacher, very fortunately. I've led history across the curriculum at both high school and primary level, either leading history as a department or looking after history across the curriculum for local schools. So history has really underpinned my career, and I've recently come away from that to use my years of classroom practice and knowledge to try and convey my passions to hopefully a lot more of a willing audience in you all. So thank you again very much for being here with me. What I like to do when I talk about the folklore of an area, I like to really focus in on a phrase that I like to call context is king. And this is where I personally, like I said, I mentioned that sweet spot between history and folklore. This for me is where we really see that coming to play. So in my personal opinion, I've written there landscape and law. In my personal opinion, I really think in order to better understand the law of an area, it's better to understand its landscape first and foremost. Because when it comes to folklore, naturally, it's the nature of the landscape of a locality that is generally what's birthing these stories in the first place. If I take an example, I'm going to be looking at lantern men this evening, time allowed, and yeah, they rely wholeheartedly on the landscape itself. They rely on the existence of sort of boggy fen marshland in order to exist in their story. So it's very important that we understand the nature of a landscape to understand the folklore coming out of it. And this is quite beautiful, really, because I think it gives each locality its own identity and its ability to develop its own voice. East Anglia, you can see a black dog image there. We all know that black shuck, who I will be covering a little bit later on. We know that black shuck is a massive part of East Anglian folklore. And that is as a macro example. But when you break that down and start looking into the microcosm of stories to do with shuck, in each smaller locality of East Anglia, we see very, very different stories of shuck arising. So again, it gives each smaller location its own voice, its ability to develop its own identity. And you can strip everything from a landscape. People can move away, they can move into an area. And I'm certainly not somebody who gatekeeps folklore. I don't think folklore belongs to the people born of a locality. I think anybody who moves into that locality and chooses that locality as their home, I think they can adopt that folklore very much as their own. And you can strip everything away from a locality, but it will never lose its historic roots. And as a result of that, I think it will never essentially lose its folkloric roots. Which, you know, naturally things change over time, as do all things in history, but roots very much remain in contact. And I want you to bear that in mind this evening when I'm talking to you about the locality of Lowestoft and its surrounding area and the stories which derive from that area itself. So Lowestoft, in terms of its locality, it's situated on the east coast of East Anglia. It's very much almost on the borderline between Norfolk and Suffolk. I'm very, very fortunate. I grew up in Beccles, right in the Waveney Valley, so right along the river that divides Norfolk and Suffolk. So my loyalties pretty much lie with both counties, so that makes me feel a bit better about the work I do. I can jump from both Norfolk to Suffolk because I feel like my loyalties growing up were kind of with both of those areas. But Lowestoft is very much a North Suffolk coastal town. It gives way to the most easterly point in mainland UK, a point known as Ness Point. Here's the Euroscope that celebrates it being the most easterly point in the UK. And there's just a wider shot there where you can see just how it doesn't look like much, but it's a marvelous location. If anybody is local and hasn't visited Ness Point yet, or if anybody's coming to the area, I really suggest you visit Ness Point. Even more so if you can get to it for sunrise. There's just a magic about feeling the sunrise and the immediate heat from the sun at that location. So it's quite a magical spot, really. And there's also something to be said about standing in your homeland and sort of looking out at the rest of the world. So Ness Point really gives us that opportunity in Lowestoft. And Lowestoft's history really derives massively from the fact that it is a coastal town, predominantly relying on its fishing industry for the majority of its existence. Lowestoft itself is very, very old location. It's well over 900 years old as a settlement. It's mentioned in the Domesday Book of 1086, where there are about 16 to 20 households named. But it wasn't until the 14th century, really, where Lowestoft boomed. And it was during that time that the fishing industry made Lowestoft a really, really important area for England. So important, in fact, that in 1609, the first ever lighthouse in the UK was built in Lowestoft. So I think that gives you an indication of just how important it was as a location back in the medieval era. It's also had a porcelain factory that was very, very popular. I think some of that has been covered in a recent town hall talk as well. And into the Victorian era, it did rely on some tourism. It wasn't quite as popular a tourist destination as Great Yarmouth, just up the road in Norfolk, but it did have its fair share of tourists visiting it from the Victorian era onwards. Now, its fishing industry reached its peak in the 19th and 20th century. I would say its peak was really between 1870 and 1918, just before the end of the First World War. And unfortunately, after that time, we see a massive decline in the fishing industry in Lowestoft. And by the 1960s, the fishing industry was barely hanging on. It was a whisper of what it used to be, and that was majoritively due to overfishing, but also new EU tariffs that had been put in place. So unfortunately, at that time and since, I feel like Lowestoft has genuinely struggled with what its identity really is. I've grown up living next to Lowestoft my entire life, and I feel sort of almost a sadness as the town has been in decline, a town that doesn't know what its identity is or what it will have as an identity moving forward, which is where I really urge it to lean into its most easterly point and its most easterly folklore, therefore. And what a lot of people don't know about Lowestoft is that it actually, during the 1970s, enjoyed quite a reputation as a distinct paranormal capital of England. And again, I didn't really know this growing up. This was something I wasn't made aware of. And I really urge Lowestoft to refine these roots, because I think moving forward, it's something, especially during the folkloric revival, which we're having at the minute, which is sort of been going on for a good almost decade, I would say, if not a bit longer. I think it's something Lowestoft can lean into in order to bring more tourists to the area and more interest to the area, and really redefine its own personality again and its own story. Now, during the 1970s, when there was another folklore revival, we have a lot to thank the Borderline Science Investigation Group for, the BSIG. Here they are pictured. This is from an article in the Lowestoft Journal all about their work, which was basically scrutinising strange East Anglian law and phenomenon that were happening both past and present. And their findings were published in a quarterly zine known as Lantern. I've got some images there that you can see. I am quite frankly obsessed with Lantern. I love the imagery of it. I love that it sounds like a proto-metal band from the era. There's just something about it that's just so English and so odd and so well researched as well, I must say. And quite fortunately, I sadly don't own any physical copies myself, but you can access the back catalogue of Lantern magazines on the Hidden East Anglia website, which, if you've not seen them before and you haven't ever visited the Hidden East Anglia website, then I strongly urge you to do so, because it is a treasure trove of oddities from East Anglia, folklore, weird history, the paranormal. It's superb. Now, to the left of that picture, sporting an amazing head of hair, which you still kind of have, Ivan. I know you're watching. I'm going to say hello. So to the left, second left, sorry, is Ivan Bunn. He is a very, very close friend of mine, adopted family member, mentor, you name it. He is those things to me. So I'll say hi to Ivan and Leslie for that. His birthday's tomorrow, actually, on Walpurgis, which is awesome. You know, life is good when your mentor was born on the night of all evil. So happy birthday for tomorrow, Ivan. He is someone who has done so much for the locality of Lowestoft in terms of putting its weirdness on the map, and I love him for it. He's had many different publications out and about in the world. You can access A Return to Haunted Lowestoft, which is his most recent publication. I've got my copy here. You can access that online. And it details a lot of the paranormal that has gone on in Lowestoft, also including all of his research on the Lowestoft witches. There's also been a town hall talk that he's done on the Lowestoft witches, which is on YouTube, which I strongly urge you to watch as well. And he's really helped to prove the importance historically of Lowestoft through those movements and through that history. There have been many notable ghosts throughout Lowestoft's existence. I don't have time to really go through all of them now. And when I talk about Lowestoft, you can distinctly separate Lowestoft into the old town and the new town. I'm focusing in more on the old town here. But what I thought I would do is I would bring attention to my particular favourite element of Lowestoftian folklore, history and paranormal activity. I think it's why I love it so much, because it actually sort of hits that unholy trinity of paranormal, folklore and history all in one location. So these are the Witches' Stones, also known as the Swimming Stones, that rest in Bellevue Park. Now, the actual stones themselves were part of a beacon base that was built in 1550, 19 years before the first lighthouse arrived. And of course, this was one of two beacons in Lowestoft. Massive fires that would have been lit, that would have provided a vital lifeline for those at sea. So they were a very important historical site for Lowestoft itself. But they also contain a little bit more history in that one of the witches who was involved in the Lowestoft witch trials, I don't have too much time to go into those, but of course, check out Ivan's town hall talk where he talks about them. But essentially, the Lowestoft witch trials were incredibly important because the spectral evidence that was used in order to condemn both the innocent women involved, Amy Denny and Rose Cullender, the spectral evidence that was used, that template was then put in place for the Salem witch trials about 30 years later. So it's an incredibly important piece of witchcraft history, not only for East Anglia, not only for England and the UK, but also worldwide. But Amy Denny, one of the suspected and accused witches, was said in her lifetime to spend time at these stones. She lived very close to the stones. She was said to sit upon the stones cursing passers-by. And of course, unfortunately, it was this antisocial behaviour which in part led to her downfall. But there are those that believe that her ghost still haunts these stones today. Come along to its folklore, and this is where we see its name of the Swimming Stones come into play. These stones on Midsummer Night are said to, at the strike of midnight, run down to the sea and then run back to their resting location again before the 12th clock chime. I don't really know why. I don't think many people really have a definitive answer for why they are supposed to do that. And there are even those that believe that they do it more than just on midsummer. I assume it has something to do with them being a fire beacon and putting themselves out. I'm not quite sure. Don't take my word for it on that one. But they are also an apparent weather maker. So if you would like rain on a particular day, it's said that you can take water down to the stones, douse them in it, and request them nicely for it to rain on a particular day, and it shall happen. So yeah, really, really cool part of Lowestoft's history, folklore, and paranormal activity, all wrapped up into one location. I thought I would focus in on our very namesake for this evening, the Lowestoft Town Hall, which has given rise to a lot of different incidences over time and throughout history. It's been quite an important and interesting point for Lowestoft and its people. I just want to say very quickly, credit where credit's due to David Butcher. His work on recording the project of the local fishing industry between 1976 and 1983 is where I've received a lot of my information from. You can find all of these tape recordings in the Suffolk County Oral History Collection now, and there's more information on them as well on the Lowestoft Old and Now website. But he recorded individuals from the fishing industry and based his questions and their answers sort of around 1910 to 1960, focusing on life in the fishing industry and life in Lowestoft in general. And one of the stories that he focuses in on particularly is all to do with the Town Hall riot and raid of 1933. And this has a lot to do with an individual named Teddy Quantrill from a recording that's entitled Living from the Sea, a section of those recordings. So here's Lowestoft Town Hall in 1905. At its former glory, and of course part of the reason why we're here this evening is that we're looking to restore the town hall to its former glory later this year. But in 1933, on the 8th of May, this was the location of the town hall raid, or the town hall riot, as it's also known. And Teddy Quantrill was one of the individuals involved. Now, again, I spoke to you earlier about context giving rise to folklore or paranormal stories. Just to give you a little bit of context on this one, this was in 1933. So, of course, we're in the interwar period, and we are at a time of massive economic recession worldwide. Everybody's feeling the pinch. The industry is most severely hit by that recession in the UK was the fishing industry and the building industry, both industries in which Lowestoft heavily relied on, of course, the fishing industry being the most prevalent. To give you a rough guidance, there was about 20% unemployment in England at this time, but Lowestoft was feeling that even harder, and there were around 2,000 to 3,000 unemployed individuals, with Teddy Quantrill being one of those, one of the people involved. Basically, up to 100 people on that day marched on the town hall peacefully, may I add, simply to protest about the removal, the withdrawal of the coal relief ticket payment. I won't go into too much detail on this one, but it was basically the social system at the time massively failing the poor and massively failing those in need. So the 100 who marched on the town hall were doing so because they simply had nowhere else to turn. They were already suffering financially, and they needed answers, or they needed help moving forward. Now, of those 100 people, this happened over 2 days. 27 men were arrested between the ages of 17 and 49, with Teddy Quantrill being one of those individuals. Now, he, in his interview, talks about how it was a primarily peaceful protest, but the way in which he was treated, as were the other protesters, by the police, and the way in which their experiences in prison, in Norwich prison, where they were sent, did not match the peaceful nature of that protest. And you've got a quote there of how rough these individuals were treated by the law enforcement that dealt with them at the time. He went on, after being arrested and spending time in Norwich prison, he did go on to conduct naval service during World War II and became quite a local legend on the chromatic accordion. So he lived quite a adventurous and interesting life, did Teddy Quantrill. But I found it quite interesting reading his interviews. There was quite a sad moment when he talked about, whilst he was in prison, he had a son who was only a baby, and his father-in-law took care and custody of this child whilst he was in prison. And he used to push the baby around Lowestoft town centre wearing a placard that basically said, "My father is absent. He's currently in prison for fighting for his own rights." So I thought that was quite an interesting and sad element to the tale. But the story gets a little bit more interesting when we add a paranormal twist to it. So Teddy died in 1988. And there had been rumblings, talk at the town hall, which was now defunct, essentially, officially closing in 2005. But in the 90s, in the 80s, it was pretty much defunct at that point. Teddy dies in 1988, and around that time is when a caretaker of the town hall starts to report some ghostly goings on in and around the building. He mentions hearing footsteps inside. He mentions hearing doors slamming, but most prominently, he mentions somebody knocking on the main doors of the town hall. And I can't help being the paranormal weirdo that I am of putting the two together and wondering whether or not Teddy returned back to that site to fight for the justice of the people of Lowestoft once more. Now, Lowestoft has had its fair share of run-ins with the devilish and the demonic over the course of its history. And by that, no, I don't mean the 1995 incident when Mr. Blobby visited Pleasurewood Hills, as demonic as that is. This was a postcard you could get at the time. I personally think I need it in my own collection. And I mean, even getting footage from this is demonic. This is as demonic as it gets, if you ask me. Those of you that grew up in the 90s or a millennial or above like I am, can you believe that we used to live like this? Not that we saw like this, but everything was in standard definition. How archaic. And here he is sat in some kind of JFK style motorcade. Nobody took the shot, of course, but if you look in the background, there appears to be a woman in red on the grassy knoll. How strange. They don't call me Conspiracy Cage for nothing. And by they, I mean my family. But yeah, the tin hat is always firmly on. Moving on, of course, I am talking about Black Shuck. Our boy. He is a massive, massive part of East Anglian folklore. He is the most iconic, the most synonymous with East Anglia, and I think the most beloved element of East Anglian folklore. I don't have too much time to go through Shuck's origin story this evening, so I'm going to bypass that, making the assumption that already a lot of you will know a little bit about Shuck's origin story and background. Do not fear if you don't know. In the run-up to the Black Shuck Festival in Bungay at the start of August, on my Instagram account, I'll be putting up a lot of posts about the lore and the background to Black Shuck. So do not worry, that information will come in due time if it is something that you want to hear. Shuck's name itself is quite interesting. It derives from the Old English word for demon, which is skucker. But I have also heard a local tell me, I don't know if this is written down anywhere, this just seems to be sort of oral tradition passed on. But I have had a local tell me before that Shuck's name is derived from the sound that his large paws make as he is plodding up a stony beach. That sort of shuck, 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 which is quite ghostly when you think about it and sort of adds to that lore. So I definitely lean into that. He is, as I've said, a massive part of East Anglian folklore, appearing during a raging storm, as his origin story tells us. But quite interestingly, the earliest account I can find relating to a Shuck-like figure in East Anglia actually comes from the Peterborough Chronicle in 1127. So this is potentially how old Shuck's history is with East Anglia and where this folklore potentially derives from. A terrible din of spectral huntsmen, hounds and horses. The hounds were jet black with eyes like saucers and horrible. I like that addition there. And if you didn't think they were horrible enough, they were horrible and horrible. And according to my research, I think the first, please correct me if I'm wrong online, anybody afterwards, I believe the earliest account that mentions Shuck in name comes from 1850, the Reverend E.S. Taylor, writing in a Journal of Notes and Queries. I think that's the first time we actually see Black Shuck's name in print. But I want to focus a little bit more on Black Shuck in Lowestoft, because obviously we're here to talk about Lowestoft, and much like many different localities in East Anglia, Shuck has his own particular stories within Lowestoft. There is said to be a phantom dog who haunts the very steep area of Rant's Score. So whether that's Shuck or not, we're not too sure. In 1975 in Bellevue Park, the same location where the witches' stones are, a husband and wife were walking through the park at night time when the wife could very, very clearly see a very large black dog standing in nearby bushes, but the husband could not see it at all. I've got an account from 1938 and 1939, and it's actually an account of shuck which is linked to some bad luck. Now, for those of you that aren't aware, typically the story goes in East Anglia that if you are to come across black shuck, if you are to witness or experience shuck, then it's not a good omen, let's put it that way. And there are those that say that you'll be dead within a year. There's different twists to this tale. There are people who say, see him once, it's not a good sign. See him twice, you're definitely dead. There are others that say, don't talk about your experience for a year, and then after that, you're fine. So there's different variations of this account. But in 1938-39, a direct incident involving what was believed to be shuck was linked to very, very misfortunate event for Lowestoft town. There was a huge town loss of a fishing boat known as Shore Breeze. It was a very, very important part of Lowestoft's fishing industry fleet. And its sinking was linked to a run-in that an individual had along the A12 cycling at night time. That is the road that connects Lowestoft and Kessingland to one another. Now, this individual claimed that upon riding their bike, out of nowhere, a huge black dog appeared. And it appeared so quickly in front of him. In his own words, he says that it was suddenly upon him. He could not slow down, he could not stop his bike, but was shocked at the fact he simply raced straight through the dog, and upon doing so felt a cold, chilly sensation all over his body. He also notes that this dog was very large, but also just like a skipper dog that skippers would take onto boats when they went out fishing. And because of that very, very incident, people related the sinking of the Shore Breeze to shuck. In the 2000s, so we're moving up to more modern history, there were two witnesses leaving Pleasurewood Hills, no less, walking along Gunton Cliffs at night, where they saw a big black dog running on its hind legs. I find this one really creepy. It was running on its hind legs and it was about 7 feet tall. And it had glowing eyes like coffee mugs. Apparently, according to these individuals, the dog, whilst running, spotted them, paused, looked directly at them, and then carried on running, which is a really, really creepy story. I'm going to go to Ivan's Haunted Lowestoft because there's an account actually, and I think it's probably one of the most malicious versions of Shuck's story that I've actually come across. And he talks about a very strange incident that happened in Lowestoft connected to Black Shuck. He says here, many years ago, a very strange story was told around the neighbourhood in which an Italian man came to the town and befriended a young fisher boy. He tried to persuade the lad to accompany him to foreign parts, but was refused. One day, the Italian told the boy that he had to go away and asked him to look after his large black dog until he returned. Every morning, the boy and the dog would go for a swim in the sea off Ness Point, which you saw earlier. However, one day the boy swam out further than usual and, much to his horror, found that the dog would not let him return to the shore. It growled and snapped at him, forcing him further and further out to sea. Terrified, the boy swam on. Every time he stopped, the dog was close behind with its teeth bared in a hideous snarl. At one point, when he turned and looked at the creature, he saw for a brief moment that it had taken on the appearance of its Italian master. The change was only fleeting, and he was again confronted by the savage, snapping jaws. Fortunately, just as he reached the point of exhaustion, a passing smack spotted him and pulled him on board, his neck and shoulders lacerated and bleeding from the dog's bites. The beast then dived like a porpoise and was never seen again. Likewise, its master. I think that's one of the most malicious Black Shuck stories that I've personally come across, and I love how it directly links Black Shuck to Lowestoft's maritime location. Now, I wanted to put a little bit of a spin on this because in recent years, I would say that there's definitely been more of a shift in terms of how individuals in East Anglia consider Shuck. Don't get me wrong, there's still very much those that see Shuck as a malicious beast, as a bad omen, as a warning sign. But there are those, and I would maybe count myself as one of those individuals now who are starting to see Shuck as almost a guardian, a protector of East Anglia. And it's quite an interesting way to think of Shuck, maybe not as this evil demonic figure that we've seen, but maybe as actually a local guardian. It's just, I'm playing devil's advocate, pun intended here, and just showing you and demonstrating to you that there's actually two sides to this folklore, which I think is quite an interesting development. Like I mentioned earlier, things naturally change over time. Now, I don't know how many of you saw last year Charlie Cooper's Myth Country. Episode 1, he investigated Black Shuck, which is obviously very, very exciting. And I know the Norfolk Folklore Society were a big part, a big feature of that television show. So I'll say hello to the Norfolk Folklore ladies. This was a moment that my brother-in-law was involved in. You can see him there, John. He's pictured with a painting. And there's a bit of a background story to this. And I know as a TV show, it would have been pressed for time. There would have been different elements of production. But I think they kind of missed a trick here, because the story that John was sharing that day was much to do with his father's run-in with Shuck and how he came to view it. It happened 50 years prior. His dad, Joe, he's a very well-known local artist. Joe Crowfoot is his name. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2017. But with Joe's skills as an artist, Joe was actually able to paint what he saw during his fateful run-in with Shuck. And I've got a close-up for you here. This is a photograph that Joe then painted Shuck over the top of to depict his likeness. It's a very interesting story, and it kind of flips on its head what people tend to come and think about Shuck. I don't necessarily want to be the one to share this with you. I think my brother-in-law John tells this story on his dad's behalf a lot better than I do. So I'm going to play for you now an audio clip, a somewhat interview. That sounds really formal. A chat with my brother-in-law about what happened with his father that day. We've had lots of fun with this as a family. Emphasis on the pronunciation of Canoan. I'll say East Anglian born and bred. Hey, John, I'll raise a drink to that. But enjoy this audio of John sharing the story of what happened to his father when he ran into Black Shuck and how he came to view that experience in his later years.
Okay, I'll talk about Dad's encounter with Black Shuck. 1974, I don't know the month. My dad and a friend of his, who I won't name because I'll come to why that is later, used to go sea canoeing. My dad's friend had extensive experience at the sea. He knew tides, he knew races, all the hazards, this, that, and the other. And they used to go, on this particular night, they're going to Orford, and they're going to go around Bordsey, where the radar base was. Out to sea, simple little 2-seater kayak, go round, come back. Done it many, many times before. So they're driving from Geldeston, and they're going through Hensted. And in Hensted, there's a little bridge over a small river that I don't know the name of. And this is middle of the night, early hours of the morning, dark. And all of a sudden, Dad said that not appeared, it was just there. It wasn't like it wandered in the sight. In front of them, about 6 feet, 8 feet away from the front of the car, was a huge dog. He said it was the size of a calf. It had a mane, all black. And what unnerved my dad is that it stood there and just stared at him. It didn't have, fire coming out of the side, but he said it was just staring him down and standing in the middle of the bridge. And Dad looked at his friend and saw, the expression, what on earth's that? Looked back, and there was absolutely nothing there. And they were both perturbed, to say the least. So they got out of the car, had a look under the bridge. In the 1970s, that area now is all overgrown, but in the 70s it was open. Looked under the bridge, looked around, absolutely nothing there at all. And I think they had the conversation, what on earth did we just see? And I think my dad, I don't know about his friend, but I think my dad was aware of, the tales of Shuck. I don't know if he said, was it Shuck? He may well have done. But anyway, they continued on their journey. So that night, when they went out to sea, where they had been lots of times before, and remember his friend knew his stuff, there's a freak tidal race. And they both got swept out of the kayak, some distance from the shore, and they were both, well, I can't speak for him, but Dad was convinced they were going to drown. And it was quite a struggle to get onto the beach, and they did. Other things ensued with the radar station, which probably isn't pertinent to this, but that's another story for another time. Anyway, when they got back, my dad didn't tell Mum what happened for a year and a day, because his belief was that if you encountered shark, which he was then convinced it was, and you survived, you shouldn't say anything for a year and a day. I don't know where he got that from, but that's what he stuck to. And that's a story that's been part of my life. As long as I can remember. I'm 50 now, so I've probably known it 45 years plus. And the interesting thing is, it never changed. He never made the dog more fantastical. He never gave it other attributes. The story is always the same. A calf-sized dog with a mane, black, and just piercing, staring eyes. And Dad, well, I won't even say convinced, Dad saw black shark. In the 1990s, my dad was a self-employed artist. He sold a painting to a guy who had a farmhouse somewhere near this bridge. And I went with him at school holiday, whatever. And he said to the bloke, he said, how long have you lived around here, mate? And the guy said, since the 50s. And he said, really odd question. He said, in the 70s, did anyone around here own big dogs like hounds, wolfhounds, whatever? And the bloke said, no. He said, any farmers have dogs? Like, no. I said, oh, okay. So obviously that still played on Dad's mind. Well, that would have been 20 plus years later. But interestingly, later in life, my dad passed away when he was 71, but probably from his early 60s onwards, he did view it differently. And he actually still saw shark. He was absolutely 100% certain of that. But he saw him as a guardian, because his hypothesis, if you like, was if they hadn't stopped, and if they hadn't have taken time to look under the bridge for however long it took, I don't know, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 10 minutes, he felt very strongly, just innately, that had they not stopped, they would have died. The tidal race would have been much worse. So he came to view shark as a guardian of his life, actually, and sort of felt reasonably affectionate towards it, if you can believe that. Interestingly, and I have spoken to the unnamed individual, well, I won't name him. I have spoken to him in quite recent years, and he won't talk about it. He will not talk about what happened that night, and he evidently still views it as evil and malevolent and whatever else. So the two guys who saw it, how many years later it would be, 40 years, 45 years later, viewed it completely differently. And that's the story that's been in my family all my life. I'm 50. Always known the story. My mum did, and other people like my sister-in-law have known it. Who could that be? So that's I was fortunate enough to have probably I think the only first-hand account with a vivid description of shark. No sound associated. I guess they're in the car. They wouldn't necessarily have heard anything anyway. No obvious sort of howling. He said the beast was just static and staring at him. So that is a primary account. Yeah.
Then that he created off the back of that experience, that makes that I don't want to say a primary sort of.
Well, yeah. What happened is, because I was always interested in folklore, and probably because I've known that story from as a wee lad. And in 2015, Dad and I drove to the place, and he took a photograph of the bridge. And then, because he was a good artist, that's what he'd done for a living, he painted the image of what Chuck looked like over the top of it. And on the painting, there's mist around him, but that wasn't the case on that. It's just so he can get him on the picture in a way. But there was no mist around him. But so, sort of speaking to Norfolk folklore ladies and people like that, I think that's the only 20th century, at least, first person, primary source depiction of shark, which have.
He's now staring people down as they walk into my house.
Good luck to him.
So he is a guardian, really.
He is a guardian of your house, yeah. Perfect symmetry.
So here is the painting up in my kitchen. We live in the old Ship Meadow workhouse, and we use the kitchen door as the main entrance. And I now have the painting situated in what I believe to be the only fitting place for that painting, staring out over the amazing views of the Waveney Valley. So Shuck remains a guardian. I feel as if he is a guardian of my house. And it's just interesting to hear that two individuals who experienced the exact same moment with Shuck came to view the incident completely differently. Moving on to another spectral element of East Anglian folklore, I'm going to focus in on the hateful thing. Again, quite a well-known piece of East Anglian folklore. I won't spend too much time on its origins, but my very, very good friend, Chris Bolton, hi Chris, and Sarah as well if you're watching, and Trough if you're watching, he has published an amazing book called Apparitions of East Anglia. It's Norwich Castle endorsed. It's now in their gift shop, which is superb. If anything interests you from this evening, or if you really want to have sort of an introduction to East Anglian folklore, I cannot recommend this book enough. Now, in Apparitions of East Anglia, Chris details a little bit about the hateful thing, which is majoritively associated with Geldeston, which is a couple of fields that way from me. I think our metric in East Anglia is how many fields away something is, even in 2026. So yeah, it's a few fields out. It's quicker for me to walk to Geldeston than it is to drive, just to give you a heads up on that one, an indication of how we live in these parts. But the hateful thing is less of something you see and more of something you experience. If you do see the hateful thing, it appears simply as sort of a sinister looking sort of fog, a black foggy sort of image. But most accounts referring to the hateful thing or experiences with the hateful thing simply have derived from people's physical reactions to being around the hateful thing. It's quite interesting because the hateful thing's history goes all the way back to feminist folklorist M.H. James. She was actually the first woman to document East Anglian folklore in her Bogie Tales of East Anglia book. She was, of course, the cousin of very, very famous horror author M.R. James, who I'm sure you've heard of, even if you haven't heard of her. Now, in Bogie Tales of East Anglia, is where we sort of come across an introduction to this concept of the hateful thing. But it's also said to appear a lot in the Geldeston area, but also I've heard stories of it appearing very much so in that borderline area between Norfolk and Suffolk, between that boundary line, as it were. And within Bogie Tales of East Anglia, she documents how her uncle experienced a hateful thing. This is where we see sort of an origin story for this concept, really. She says how it was there he saw a hateful thing of his own, an unimaginable horror that lay in wait in the darkness and crept towards him when he blinked. Pink, malevolent, and with large open eyes, the creature peered at him from a hole in the garden gate before shambling away into the trees. She talks about how her uncle was incredibly shaken up by this experience and how it created a sensation within him that genuinely overrided his fight or flight reaction, which is what most people have when they're presented with a threat. It's just basic human instinct. And she also comes to therefore explain it more from the term of a swoundling, which sounds a lot cuter than it actually is. A swoundling, its name derives from the idea that if you see a swoundling, and I would count the hateful thing within one of these apparitions, if you come across a swoundling or have an experience with a swoundling, it is said that you will swoon on the spot, you will drop, it will override your fight or flight, and you will also end up having a massive sensation of ominous darkness, like something bad is going to happen. You have chills all over your body, you get sweaty, clammy. And it's said that if you have a run-in with the hateful thing, the folklore now goes that either something awful has already happened in the location in which you are experiencing those feelings, or something terrible is about to happen. So in East Anglia, typically those that experience the hateful thing are urged to move very quickly away from where they are. That is if they don't swoon first. Now, quite interestingly, I wanted to share with you another personal anecdote when it comes to the hateful thing. My brother-in-law and John, who you've seen, and my sister Vic, they live in Borough St Peter. And it was one night last year in August when my brother-in-law had an encounter which I personally believe was with the hateful thing. This is the road in which they live on. It's called Mill Road. And this is looking down towards the main entrance of the road. So the furthest point you can see is the main entrance to the road. And he was dropped off by a friend there after partaking in a very rock and roll hobby of playing bowls. He was dropped off there by a friend in twilight hours, so about the light that you can see in this photograph that I've got for you. And John walked along the road towards his house, which is roughly where I'm standing in that photograph. And during that walk, he has to walk past the place of the old mill in Borough St Peter. It's now been converted into a house, but just so you have an idea, this is what it looked like when it operated as a mill. Now, passing this particular spot, John had an experience which I think is very, very similar to those which are described of having a run-in with the hateful thing. And he was so shaken up by the experience that my sister, upon coming home about 10 o'clock, saw him and was genuinely like, have you seen a ghost? And he immediately wrote down what had happened to him and shared it with me. I guess out of interest, he knew I'd be, you know, concerned for his well-being, but above all, fascinated in the paranormal experience that he'd just had. So he says here that near the old mill, he had an awareness of somebody watching him very, very intently and with not a nicety to them. It was a very hateful stare. He felt temperature drop, goosebumps, hairs on end, that clammy sweatiness that has been described with run-ins with the hateful thing. He also very interestingly notes that all background noise completely diminished. So the bird song that you typically get in East Anglian rural parts during twilight completely vanished. And this sensation continued for a good 40 meters up the road. And he said, we walked the ground when he was telling me this story, and he was explaining how it felt like someone was staring into him so intently. It was like eyes were boring into the back of his head. Now, after about 40 meters or so, when he reached the boundary of this bush to the left-hand side, this is where the sensation stopped, and immediately everything returned to normal. Now, he didn't quite run home, but I think he was, you know, shaken up enough to move quickly back home and escape the sensation and what had just happened. But there's quite a sentimental ending to this tale, I feel. Over 10 years ago, John and Vic unfortunately lost one of their cats, Pepper, and call it an owner's intuition, owner's instinct. They believe that her remains are somewhere in that thicket. She never came home. And this thicket actually represents the end of their back garden. It's sort of like the boundary to their land. And I just find it really interesting, particularly as I consider cats as guardian figures, that John felt an end to that sensation that had carried on for a whole 40 meters up the road. Felt that sensation stop the moment he crossed the boundary in which he believes Pepper resides. So I like to think that she was fighting off that evil from the afterlife and doing the right thing by her owner. So let's move on to another part of Borough St Peter's lore. The Devil's Church, otherwise known as St Mary's Church, but I like to call it as the Devil's Church. I absolutely love this location. Those of you that do follow me on Instagram will know that I recently shared some photos. This area has a very particular import to me. It's basically the location at which I feel like the claws of folklore first sink themselves into me. I'd already been interested in what we refer to as the other or things of the night. And my brother-in-law had kind of clocked that as a youngster. I was sort of interested in those kinds of things and history. And we have quite a lot of personal history with Borough St Peter. My mum grew up in Alderby, which is basically, again, the field next to Borough St Peter. They're one in the same thing. I just, on my mum's behalf, want to give out a shout out to Uncle Mervyn. She knows why. But we've spent a lot of time in Borough St Peter. We've spent a lot of time in Alderby. I have very fond memories, a lot of walks there, foraging, walking around Boone's Heath, family weddings, you name it. And even the thatched bus stop in Alderby, my mum set fire to as a young girl. So yeah, it's quite the troublemaker. What else is there to do in rural England growing up, hey? So yeah, I've got some really fond memories of Borough St Peter and Alderby, but even as a youngster, there was something just felt odd. I can't really explain it other than feeling an essence of not out and out malevolence in the area, but something as if the soil was incredibly old and it had some not so nice stories to tell. As much as I had nice associations with the area, I couldn't shake this underlying feeling of, yeah, malevolence feels maybe a bit strong, but there was definitely something about Borough St. Peter that felt more on the evil side. So enter the Devil's Church. When I was 14 years old, John, my brother-in-law, took it upon ourselves during a family walk to take us to see this very location. And as you can see, it's an incredibly peculiar shape. That ziggurat design immediately struck me. It felt preternatural immediately. It felt really odd. It felt not of this world. And it was like something in me clicked. I immediately felt a sense of understanding, almost an explanation as to why the soil of Borough St. Peter maybe felt so untoward, maybe felt so other. And of course, as much as I have happy experiences with Borough St. Peter's, some of the weirdest events in my life have happened there. I've seen a big cat there, genuinely a huge sort of black panther crossing a road, a back road, during dusk. I believe I saw UFOs in Borough St. Peter when I was about 19 or 20, lights darting across the sky in the early hours of the morning before about 7 helicopters descended upon them and they shot straight up in the air and disappeared. Some very odd, hard to explain experiences have happened to me in Borough St. Peter. Now, this is an incredibly old site. This is pre-Christian. I think that's why I lean into it so much. There's something about it that is so other, that's so different. And any Buffy fans out there, if you personally ask me, this is the site of the entrance to the Hellmouth, in my personal opinion. I think the devil would like the irony of it being situated in a church. It's said that the ziggurat shape is steps towards heaven, but I personally think it's the inverse, and I think it steps downward. And that theory of mine is given rise to when you consider the fact that its original finial, which fell sometime after 1810, now sits at the foot of the tower. It fell and remains there, and it's on the west side of the tower, which is of course the side in which the sun sets. It's the direction most associated with the devil. It's quite interesting to me. It just adds to the lore, the thick plottons, as I would say. It gets quite interesting when you break it down like that. Now, this church itself and sort of the foundations of it date back to the 13th and 14th centuries, and actually the original door that still stands within the structure dates from the 1200s. So it's really nice to go and touch it and sort of inhale the history, feel the history racing through you if you're a weirdo like me. So it's been an incredibly old site of worship for a very, very long time. The distinctive tower itself wasn't built until 1793, but before it was formally built, it's considered to have been there for over 1,000 years. The Domesday Book in 1086 mentions it. It is believed to have been a site of worship for the Anglo-Saxons in around 700 AD. So this is a really, really old site. And it's got some fantastic folklore attributed to it. And again, these stories and the stories that John told me really helped to explain some of the feelings that I had had growing up about Borough St. Peter, and also really just helped me to understand folklore and feel a sense of understanding that there was a lot more to the world than simply what you could see or hear. And it absolutely fascinated me. And to be perfectly honest with you, I think my interest and fascination in folklore has sort of stemmed from that day. I think from about 14, I've been chasing that same feeling, which 20 years on still gives me that buzz. But there are some interesting stories to do with this, some very odd occurrences and tales to do with this church. I'm petitioning for Vic and John as locals of Borough St. Peter to bring back this one. In the early 20th century, locals would tell visitors to the area that the church tower itself was telescopic and it would wind up and down with the seasons. I definitely think that's a bit of zany folklore we need to bring back. But the main story that derives from this comes from medieval times. You know folklore is good if it's based on medieval stories. And basically, the story goes that there was a poor man sitting by the river, I think probably at the location, if you know the area, of where the Waveney River Centre now lies, which is, if you look at that photo, that's sort of the further out picture. It's just to the right of the building, just a few fields across. A poor man was sitting at the river when a stranger approached him and started to talk to him softly, and clearly had an odd knowledge of this man's financial woes, even though this man had never seen him before or explained his story to him. The pair struck a deal, and the poor man received a loan that simply had to be repaid several years later. It was recorded on parchment, and as the story goes, indeed, the man became very rich very quickly. And there are some who say that some of his wealth was actually put into the building of parts of this church. Years passed, and the day finally came for repayment. And this is where we get the Martin Scorsese level style twist to this tale. Of course, shock horror, the man who loaned him that money was none other than the devil himself. What a surprise. So he wanted to now claim back his share, his side of the bargain, which was, of course, the man's soul. However, there's a double twist to this tale. Don't know if you saw that one coming. But the man had actually recently died and was now buried in the consecrated ground of this very church, which, of course, the devil couldn't access him because of that. So it is now said that each year on May the 2nd, which is coming up, it's this Saturday. Fortunately, I'll be at my sister's wedding, so I have an excuse to not be hanging around St Mary's Church in Forest and Pier, but some of you may be free. It is said on the 2nd of May every year, a spectral skeleton, which is of course the devil, is said to hang around the churchyard looking for a soul to reclaim. There's a further interesting anecdote as well that I don't think is written down. Here is a site which is said to be home to what is known as the Devil's Stile. In this gap here between the trees is said to be where the devil will sit waiting for an innocent soul to arrive. This is northwest of the old rectory at a location known as Dick's Mount. And that's that tree in the gap in the tree line there, which, based on the archaeology of my brother-in-law, who is an archaeologist, he believes that to be the very location. But there's another element to the story of this church. There's an old organ which hasn't worked for a good 30 plus years that resides in the church still. But there is a story that people often hear organ music coming from the church despite this not working, particularly holiday makers and non-locals to the area. So quite interestingly, I wonder perhaps it could be the devil at work trying to attract non-locals who don't know the stories associated with this church to the church in order to reclaim their soul. Right, we're going to move back round to the Lowestoft area just to finish up, and we're going to look at Colton Marshes. Now, Colton Marshes isn't actually known as a paranormal capital of East Anglia, I will say. It's now a Suffolk Wildlife Trust nature reserve. So you wouldn't immediately think of Colton Marshes as somewhere paranormal, but I have a story to share with you that may change your mind. Now, Colton Marshes spans 1,000 acres. It's kind of made up of marshland, fen, dyke, and woodland, that kind of amalgamation of a lot of East Anglian landscapes all in one. And there's nothing, you can see here an aerial photograph of it. It looks like somebody holding it, offering it up to the gods, or spinning it on their hand. I'm not quite sure. But it's an area that is filled with different water systems and waterways. And of course, this has made it an incredibly dangerous place to cross over the years. It's the site of many good school trips, I'll say. If you grew up in the Waveney Valley area, this, Framlingham Castle and Banham Zoo, they were like the holy trinity of school trips back when I was growing up. I've got some great memories from Colton Marshes, but there is something about Colton Marshes, especially in the evening, where it starts to feel a little bit eerie, and you start to feel a bit of a sense like you're being watched, and that you do suddenly start to feel, as much as it's not massively removed from civilization, you start to feel quite alone and quite isolated, especially when you're in the thicker areas of the woodland. It does very much feel like somebody's watching you. Now, I was massively gaslit by the Google gods when trying to find out more about this. This is immediately what came up when I tried to find ghost stories linked to Colton Marshes. But do not fear, East Anglian Cage is not put off by this level of gaslighting, and is certainly not put off by something claiming to be not haunted the second you Google it. Thou doth protest too much. And I just wanted to find out more. But again, upon more searching, there's no verified reports of hauntings at Colton Marshes, but it does say here that it has atmospheric landscapes which could inspire ghostly imaginations. So if we have a look at the size and shape of Colton Marshes, you can see now it runs parallel to the main roads in and out of Lowestoft. And the routes, the pathways in Colton Marshes actually still follow the historic routes that horse and carriages used in centuries past, particularly for peat digging tracks and just generally old farming tracks. So this would have been a point of crossing out of Lowestoft, but again, it would have been an incredibly dangerous location even for locals. And this is where we enter the folklore of lantern men, not typically associated with this area of East Anglia. It's much more reserved for North Norfolk and like the fen areas of East Anglia, but I believe that there's some stories linking lantern men to Colton Marshes. Lantern men, they represent the fear of locals when it comes to crossing these waterways and the idea of sort of losing your footing and falling into these murky, freezing waters and drowning. They're similar to will-o'-the-wisps that we find in other parts of folklore across the country, but they're different in the sense that they are malevolent and evil spirits. Will-o'-the-wisps will try and sort of lure people into danger. Lantern men will hunt you. They are evil spirits that are looking for victims, and not only will they hunt you, they will also, apparently according to law, follow you home. I want you to bear that in mind when I share with you an anecdote. The fear is so real. And the fear has been so real of lantern men throughout time that in the Eastern Counties magazine in 1900, there was an article that shared how you can outsmart a lantern man. The idea is that if you're with somebody else, you can try whistling to distract them and make them confused as to your whereabouts. But it also says that if you lie face down, if you're on your own, lie face down with your mouth open in the hopes that the lantern man will simply pass you by. But the whistling is very important here because, again, lantern men are notoriously said to attack dog walkers because the whistling attracts them. They are drawn to the sound of whistling. And of course, if you've particularly got a dog off lead and you're walking them around a marshy area, you're going to be whistling to call them back. I'm bringing the theory closer to home because it talks about here how there's an unpleasant habit of a lantern man to follow an individual home, following the wayfarer home and lighting up their windows from the outside. And I really want you to, again, bear in mind the whistling and bear that in mind when I tell you the following story. There was an individual named Joseph Bexfield, who is buried in All Saints Church in Felton, which is simply 20 minutes from here, not all the way up in the fens, simply 20 minutes from here. He was a bargeman who operated a barge between Norwich and Great Yarmouth along the River Yare. And one evening, he realised he'd left a package for his wife on the barge. He'd been out drinking with his friends and said, I'm just going to go pick up the package. They implored him not to go, understanding the stories of lantern men, and Joseph very confidently said, I know these waterways incredibly well. Unfortunately, Joseph never returned and his body washed up 3 days later. And he is believed to be or have been a victim of a lantern man. There is a personal story that I have to share with you. My very good friend Vivian, who was an individual that I got to know through doing my talks at the Geldeston locks. She shared with me anecdotes about what had happened to her when she was living in the railway cottage just outside of Colton Marshes. Now, interestingly, this location is also as remote as Colton Marshes. It's just outside of Colton Marshes and it's known as the railway cottage. But she wrote down for me some very strange experiences that she had here. She only lived here 6 months, but she had some very odd occurrences happening to her, typically to do with her dogs. She said she was walking the dogs one day and one of them fainted, but they managed to bring her around and she was okay. A while later, she rushed another one to the vets. They operated. She had a twisted gut, but she died. 2 weeks later, she rushed another of her dogs to the vet. She had 5 and 3 of them fell very ill or had very bad luck while she was living at the cottage for 6 months. They operated, she had fermented grass in her stomach, and they saved her. My son and I took his dog and my youngest for a walk on the marsh. His dog ran out on the railway line and mine followed, fell into a ditch and couldn't get out. I could hear a train, so I went onto the line and got the dog off just in time, and my son hauled mine from the ditch. He had sank so far that only his nose was above water, and he just about saved him. She left there after 6 months. And the first night she was away, she realised that she was able to take the dogs out in the evening. She realised the entire time she had been at the railway cottage, she had never wanted to take the dogs out at night. And she recalled a specific incident where one evening she awoke to lights floating around outside her house. She immediately hid. She was in her bedroom, hid under the covers, and waited for morning, assumingly falling asleep, but refused to acknowledge the lights or head outside. And with the bad luck with the dogs and everything that happened with them, and with the spectral lights floating around outside her house, I can't help but wonder if perhaps there is the spirit of lantern men hovering around inside Carlton Marshes. And when you think about how remote the location is and what its history would entail, remember the law of the land deriving from its history and how many people potentially lost their lives crossing that boggy area. And I think it starts to make sense. And I really think we should start perhaps seeing Carlton Marshes as a lot more of a paranormal epicenter than what we currently do. So just to finish off, in terms of the folkloric future of Lowestoft, so Cage's final thoughts. I think if Lowestoft itself is struggling with its identity and is struggling to know what it can potentially offer, I urge it to really reclaim its ghostly and folkloric identity, because it's got so much to share. There's so many more stories that I could have shared with you this evening, and lean into it being the most easterly point. It's therefore got the most easterly ghosts, the most easterly folklore. It's a really niche point for it to focus and lean into. And we have the ubiquitous woman in white. She sort of exists everywhere. We have a woman in white in the workhouse, but she is said to haunt the housing estate next to Benjamin Britten High School in Lowestoft. But that was built in 1978. So it goes to show really that wherever people are, old or new, there's always going to be folklore to share. There's always going to be ghostly tales to tell. And I really urge Lowestoft to lean into that and to share that with the world. So on that, I want to say thank you very much. Thank you for being here this evening. If you don't already, please follow me on Instagram. My handle is East Anglian Cage. If you have any questions or you think of any after this evening, I don't mind you emailing it to me at all. I've got my email there, eastangliancage@gmail.com. Thank you so much for being here with me this evening. And yeah, I appreciate your time and your patience and your listening. Thank you very, very much.
Mr. Blobby deep dive needed, says Paul Hardy. So he might just become part of the folklore, potentially.
His demonic visit in 1995.
I love the story of the sort of like coastal Lowestoft black shuck and the Italian guy.
Yeah,
that's very eerie.
Yeah, it is. I think it's one of the nastiest versions of.
It's nasty.
Yeah,
that's almost.
I've heard.
That's almost not like the two Lowestoft ones, like the dog on its hind legs and the sort of aggressive, the aggressive one. Almost don't sound like Shuck. How I think of Shuck. I don't think of him as bad.
It's an interesting local debate, I think. Definitely should be explored more. Those that see him as this malevolent figure, or those that see him as more of a local guardian. I think it's a really interesting debate.
So is he always had those two sides to him? Like
I don't believe so, no. I feel like the I mean, again, for individuals perhaps they may have seen him over time as a guardian, but I think that's more of a recent development in his law, and that may be to be attached to things like the prevalence of the Black Shuck Festival in Bungay. That's becoming hugely popular and bringing so much tourism to the area that I can't help but wonder perhaps that's maybe changing people's perceptions of Shuck, and again seeing it as more of a, I don't want to say poster boy, that sounds really odd, but even if you go to Bungay itself, I mean, his image is emblazoned everywhere. You can see Shuck on the weather vane in the centre of the town, on the football team, he's on their shirts. There's the Black Dog Running Club that have Shuck emblazoned over their jerseys. So he really is everywhere. There's murals of him. So yeah, it's an interesting one, and I do love personally how much Bungay is embracing the story and
Definitely.
that lore.
Oh, someone's saying there's a similar shuck in the sea story at Cromer. That's interesting.
That is interesting.
That's very
Yeah.
interesting. I'm very curious now.
Yeah. Same.
Oh, someone is asking, what's your favourite piece of Norfolk folklore?
Well, that's a nice question. I've already mentioned how the Devil's Church at Borough St Peter. I think that one. I think I can't come away from that one really because it's got its own personal history with me. It's the thing that really got me into folklore. But there was something I wanted to talk about tonight that I really didn't have time for, and that was the story of Grimm's. And this is a particular in East Anglia, and it's dog guardians. To very basically sort of outline the story, dog guardians who were the first sort of sacrifice made upon the building of a new church, to ensure that no new soul buried there suffered in purgatory. The idea was that the first soul buried in newly consecrated ground couldn't go to heaven or hell. So dogs were sacrificed, majoritively dogs were sacrificed and buried in graveyards. And they would basically be the wardens of souls and help them on their journey into the afterlife. There's a bit more to it than I have time for, but I really like the story of Grimm's. I think that's there's a heartwarming element to it, but they also, as with a lot of things in East Anglian folklore, have quite a malicious and malevolent side as well. So I quite like that switch.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
So possibly a cousin to the shuck.
Yeah. Yeah, more of a swoundling, actually, I think. Yeah.
So Richard's saying, I've heard of a few spooky stories about Carlton Marshes. So, oh, that's fantastic. So if you share those with Katie, that would be absolutely fantastic if you're able to do that. That would be, and then she can relay them to us. We love the spooky stories here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Please email them to me.
Yeah. Again, yeah, I want to say thank you and thanks everyone for attending. So, yeah, brilliant. Enjoy your evenings. Don't be too scared. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.